Okay, welcome to the first in the urban permaculture series. We're going to talk about the first permaculture principle, observe and interact. So, if we're living in a city or an urban environment, there's probably lots of things we see every day. But it's by stopping and observing what happens to things like water, wind, sunlight, vegetation, wildlife, even the insects. All those things in your neighborhood or in your city can be a really helpful way to understanding things that the environment might need. Permaculture, first and foremost, is a design approach that thinks in terms of systems. So in cities, these systems can be harder to spot because there's a lot going on, and natural systems have often been disrupted or replaced by something else entirely. One thing that you're probably going to notice right away is just the number of limiting factors. If you're doing a permaculture design for a 5-acre farm on what is a mostly empty lot out in the country somewhere, it's going to be easier to observe the daily interactions of all the elements that I mentioned at the beginning. Of course, in a city or an urban setting, observe and interact means you need to be looking at what are the existing dynamics and thinking of what makes those elements unique. So, thinking about where sunlight, wind, water flow, all those things could potentially combine to create and design some sort of sustainable system. Um, One of the limiting factors, of course, is going to be it's really difficult to set up systems in an urban area like a city. However, it also means that you're going to have an abundance of something else, like microclimates. If you're just looking at a big open field in the middle of nowhere, chances are there's not going to be a lot of microclimates. There still probably would be on a large enough piece of property. But given just the huge variation of structures and things that are affecting the amount of light, wind, rain, etc., that means that that's something that you can consider in using to your advantage. So, thinking about some of the challenges that we have to be thinking about in our observing and interacting is, of course, the limits to space, possible soil contamination, zoning regulations, and of course, just the fact that you have a very human made landscape that is often not designed with anything but people in mind, and in many cities' cases, not even with people in mind. Um, but of course, you can think about, again, how you can use these elements and how they might interact with each other already, and how you can integrate permaculture into those existing landscapes. So, thinking about parks, community gardens, other community spaces, and those can be ways to help overcome space constraints. We have a limit to what we can change in a city. I can't just go out and start digging things up and planting fruit trees. In some areas, I probably can, but en masse to create a true permaculture system and have a lot of connections like we're supposed to have in permaculture is going to be really, really difficult in an urban area. Um, there's always going to be constraints, but I think that this also allows us to come up with creative solutions and really forces us to have a significant amount of community engagement. Permaculture should never happen in isolation anyway, and you should always be considering communities. And in a city, it's basically impossible not to. There's no way that you're going to be able to do a lot by yourself. You're going to need other people. I think one just sort of last note when we're thinking about the observe part, the observe and interaction part, is to think about the natural city, the natural history of your city that you're in. And this might require a little bit of research, but what was there before there was a city? Importantly, who was there? How were they using the land? And looking back at the types of not just animals and plants, but what were the ecosystems there? Because chances are maybe it's been paved over or built over, but the climate is still similar, and there's sort of a not a true desire, but there's still sort of an ingrained, like the whole life finds a way piece. There might be, there might have been a lot of streams and rivers in the city that you live in at one time. And even though those might not be visible anymore, there's a good chance that underground there's still remains of those streams, rivers, estuaries, and things like that. And there might be places where you can actually augment those rather than feeling like you have to build something from scratch. So, thinking about the species that you already see can be helpful, but also learning about what are some of the species that maybe used to be there or are really struggling, and what are some design principles that could maybe bring them back or enhance the existing population. And of course, the observe and interact piece is we're also observing interaction. So, how are the plants and animals and people in your area currently using that space? We can't overlook it. Permaculture is not about an etch a sketch redesign of everything, it's about working with what we have, and we'll get to it later, but it's actually about making small changes a lot of the time. It's not about going in and bulldozing parking lots so you can plant a beautiful community garden, although I wholly support that idea. It's about, is there a way to use that parking lot in a better way, or use a more functional element of the city that's not a parking lot to do something with. Um, Ultimately, also, you're going to be thinking about zones and what plants would thrive in there, and how you can achieve things with minimal interference. There's always going to be limitations with urban permaculture, and so I think it's just best to try to observe what are those limitations, and then how can we start thinking creatively about how to either flip that and use them to work for us, or creatively work around some of those limitations. So your homework is just go out, sit on a street corner, and just watch things happen around you. Go for a walk around your city, talk to people in the neighborhoods, see what grows well, what seems to be thriving, see what's struggling, and start to consider what are the opportunities, but also what are some of the limitations where you are.